Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Osterhout, the executive producer here at Lincoln Square, and this is Unholy Ground, where Andra Watkins and Andra Watkins translates white Christian nationalism for you all, and I ask dumb questions so that you don't have to. Andra, how are you today?
I want to say that you do a great job translating white Christian nationalism. You have learned a lot.
I have learned.
It's not just me, it's you and me, and I'm doing great.
Well, I appreciate that. It is a horror show, and I will forever blame you for dragging me into it. But also, thank you, because this is stuff that we all need to know. And I think, look, we have a nice, a really wonderful audience. And last week we did a live, and it was so good to interact in real time with everyone. And all of y'all are so here for this. And I'm so grateful for that. Not just because it's nice to feel like we're not just screaming into the void, but because this stuff really, really, really matters. And this is the thing that I think a lot of people don't get, right? Is that the white Christian nationalists sound so dumb and so weird and so cartoonish and so absurd, but they are putting these policies in place every day because they've been elected into power or appointed into power, or have inserted themselves into positions of power. And so the decisions, the policies they make are having real world benefits. No, not benefits. They're having real world impacts on our day-to-day life. Well, that's the first 2 minutes of the show. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about the work that you wrote this week, which gets a little wonky and a little financy and a little, fiscal policy-ish. So bear with us, but keep in mind that one of the levers of power that anyone can yield is the purse, right? So just to kind of set this up, the federal government at this very moment is accepting applications for a little under $3.9 billion, or right around somewhere between 3.9 and a little over $4 billion in homelessness funding. And the deadline for all comment and applications, everything, is the end of this month, end of August. So this episode is actually really prescient and important at this moment. In June, however, the White House Faith Office held a webinar that we will be posting in the after show write-up of this, so you can watch it yourself. And it was essentially to recruit churches to apply for this funding. And there was a special assistant to the president there, sort of leading this weird webinar. And he told the audience that the money is not the government's money, it's God's money. Mm-hmm. So HUD has thrown out the standard that decided who won these grants for the last decade, and we'll get to that in a minute. And more than a quarter of the pot is set aside for organizations that have never held one of these grants before. So this isn't like, what we're talking about today isn't forecasting. It's not, this could happen. This is, a potential thing. This is actually happening right this very second. And you can read about it on For Such a Time as This, Andra's incredible Substack from this week. So let's start with that webinar, Andra, because Dave Donaldson, he's a special assistant to the president inside the White House Faith Office. He said all of this stuff to a room full of faith leaders and to everyone watching the webinar, including you. Mm-hmm. He said, I heard the other day a faith leader said to me, we shouldn't touch that government money. But how many know ultimately it's not the government's money, it's God's money, and it's your tax dollars, right? Okay. Can you translate that for us?
So it's interesting to watch. I want to take us back to Project 2025, because this is total implementation of Project 2025. Yeah. This document that this regime repeatedly stated they were not using in advance of the election to do anything. So one of the things that I warned Americans about in February, starting in February of 2024, was that a goal of Project 2025 was to turn all welfare assistance into forced religious indoctrination in exchange for help. And I said they would do this across all aspects of government, wherever they could. And I cited different examples of how this language was inserted into Project 2025. They weren't saying taxpayer money is God's money. They were trying to say that faith-based organizations needed to get taxpayer money in order to provide services, and that the government needed to stop funding things that violated some people's, aka white Christian nationalists, religious liberty, or in other words, offended them. And so that's one reason why USAID was folded. And I said ultimately that USAID would come back as a taxpayer-funded missionary program for white Christian nationalism. That's why the government is giving money to far-right groups in Europe and elsewhere to finance these ideologies. That was also called for in Project 2025. Excuse me, I'm still struggling with my cold.
Me too.
So this attitude that taxpayer dollars are God's money was baked into Project 2025. It should surprise no one that they would do an almost hour-long webinar to say, this is what we plan to do with this $4 billion-ish of homeless funding that HUD distributes and Health and Human Services oversees every year. That shouldn't surprise anyone, because they said in Project 2025 that they were going to do that. And I cited a white Christian nationalist in Wisconsin in my coverage in 2024. He was a county official talking about how he vetoed funding for a male homeless shelter in the greater Madison, Wisconsin area, because he said that secular programs did not get to the root cause of homelessness. And he gave a long interview about how the root cause of homelessness is sin. And until groups that get money deal with sin problems, as defined by white Christian nationalists like him, we shouldn't be funding all of this stuff to allow people to just keep sinning. And so first and foremost, people need to prove that they are not going to keep sinning in order to qualify for a bed or a meal or a roof over their heads or other things that might help them lift themselves out of poverty. So that is the basis for this entire webinar and this entire structural change in this program. They want to offer a minimum of 25% of this $4 billion to religious organizations and faith-based groups. And one of the key changes that they're making is, under the Biden administration, any group that put in for this money had to show that they had a housing first mentality.
Right. That's the policy for over a decade or so.
Right. That the groups that apply for money for housing, for homelessness, for eradicating the unhoused and giving the unhoused places to live and be, they had to show that money was going to housing first. And which just makes sense.
And so just to kind of, there is a kind of technical definition of housing first. Essentially means you build the house first. That's it. You don't assess this person for their moral standing or their sin, threshold or their social credits or their drug, anything at all. You're building houses for people who don't have houses, right? And I think
providing housing,
or providing
housing
exactly.
for people who don't have it, right?
So, I want to talk a little bit more about this webinar, but I also want to say that this seems to me to kind of cut across the fundamental ideology of white Christian nationalism, or a fundamental, ideology, and that is humans are not inherently of value, right? That they have to qualify for value. And this you can see translated into their treatment of LGBTQ people who have failed the value test, of non-whites who have failed the value test, of women who every day, just by being who they are, fail the value test, right? So just briefly going back to this, webinar, he sort of, followed this whole thing up with a bit of a warning. He said that if faith groups don't compete for this money, then he says these funds by default are going to go to perhaps organizations that have values you do not share.
Right.
So how do you hear that?
I hear that as people are going to be required to jump through white Christian nationalist hoops in order to qualify for housing under these programs, because that's what they believe all $4 billion should go to. We should not be giving money to groups that don't make sure that these people aren't sinning, and that sin is the reason they are unhoused.
Right.
And so that is how they're trying to change who qualifies for a bed and a meal. You have to be assessed first by a white Christian nationalist and answer questions about your life that are very invasive, so that they can decide how to blame you for how you ended up unhoused. It was your sinful choices that caused this. And so we're going to come up with a plan for how you're not going to be able to commit these sins anymore. And that will be conditional. Your abiding by this plan will be conditional on your being able to be in this program. That's how they do it in these white Christian nationalist religious organizations, and that would be applying for this funding. But they really want to shift that to, that's how government funding is allocated.
Right.
You're going to have to jump through hoops and prove that you didn't sin to cause your homelessness, and deal with that sin before you're going to be able to have a meal and a bed and any shelter for the unhoused. This is why, if we go back to 2024, the Supreme Court heard a case that was out of Oregon where they actually ruled that people could be charged with a crime for being unhoused and being outside, right, because all the homeless shelters in that jurisdiction were operated by Christian groups or religious groups, and people didn't want to go to them because they had to jump through all these hoops.
Right.
And so they were sleeping outside rather than do that. And so this was an attempt to force people to have to go to these places and endure this forced religious indoctrination in exchange for help. So this is another way that this government is forcing people to, even if they don't accept white Christian nationalism or convert their minds to that, they will be forced to do things like go to church services or chapel services that are conducted by white Christian nationalists, where their attendance will be tracked.
Yep.
They will be forced to meet with unlicensed counselors. I use counselors very loosely because they'll just be white Christian nationalist church members who don't have any training whatsoever to do anything other than read the Bible and pray with these people and ask nosy questions about their lives and tell them how they cause these problems for themselves because they're sinners and they're making bad choices and they need to change those choices, and they'll have to go to one of those a week or more. Some might require them to go to a certain Sunday school class on Sunday at a specific church. Most of them will have rules like you can't date if you're single. You will have a curfew. Your phones will be confiscated. your internet usage and reading materials and everything else will be policed while you're here. Your extracurricular activities outside of here could be policed. There was a shelter in Minnesota that was for addiction that ProPublica found was requiring them to go and get SNAP cards for food and then requiring them as a condition of being in the program to hand over their SNAP cards to the shelter, which is illegal.
Wow.
So they're doing things like that as well. In a program in Texas, this is different. I called it, this is how white Christian nationalists will punish your heart on. There are programs all over Texas where they do sting operations to catch men soliciting sex. And then they either can go to jail for a while, or they can go into this program that is a white Christian nationalist lust eradication program. They happen in church basements all over, parts of Texas. And the person has to pay themselves hundreds of dollars to do this program. It's an 8-week program where they essentially go and get screamed at and have to say that their lust caused them to go seek this unholy love. That is something that some states are doing now, where they're forcing people in lieu of going to jail into white Christian nationalist indoctrination programs that are funded in part by the state and in part by the people who were forced to go. So there are all kinds of ways they're doing this. This housing piece is another big piece of it.
And housing first, and that the idea that, right, putting, you put a roof over someone's head first and then you deal with all the other stuff later. HUD's own press release calls housing first a failed ideology, which you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. And it says it encourages endless government handouts. Mm-hmm. And the new funding here cites, that idea that you're talking about, personal accountability through enhanced treatment requirements. So it's,
and treatment it's indoctrination.
Yeah, we lost you for a second, but treatment is this. All of that is not treatment; it is indoctrination. And as you mentioned the Wisconsin guy, right? Yeah. And this idea that he's saying, we're not going to turn anybody away, but if you want this housing, just listen to the Bible thing. He's being generous, right? I mean, look, of course I'm kidding, but the other thing is, like you said, this housing situation is the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Right. It's just what you see, because funds are allocated from the government. That's the only power really the government has, except through violence, through policing and that. They have the power to build roads. They have the power to, offer tax incentives. They have the power to offer public services and insurance and all of these other things. Do you see them coming at everything?
Yes. They're going to apply these purity tests, white Christian nationalist purity tests, to everything. And the only people who will be able to access these various things are people who jump through those hoops and complete and conform to those purity tests. So this is a big chunk. I mean, at least $1 billion of taxpayer money going to religious organizations and churches. And in theory, these organizations have to report to the government how the money is spent, right? To qualify for these grants,
yes,
they have to show this is how we're going to spend the money, and they have to come back and say, this is how we spent the money, right? But churches don't have to do that.
Well, so everyone, if you're just joining us, this is Unholy Ground, and we're talking about this $3.9 billion in federal homelessness money. And also a new set of rules that is opening the door to religious groups, and a White House official who called your tax dollars, not kidding, God's money. So I want to turn to this, what you're kind of starting to get into already. what happens after the money goes out the door, because there's a kind of paperwork difference, and this is where we get a little wonky. Now, a regular nonprofit that takes federal money files a form 990 or something with the IRS every year, right?
Right, so, and it essentially is part of their continuing to have their nonprofit status. They have to show that the money that they came in was spent on programming that they said they would provide,
right,
to qualify to be a nonprofit. So
what does a church have to file?
Nothing. Religious organizations have to file that form. Churches don't have to file that form. Churches don't have to report anything to the federal government. They don't have to file anything.
So in 2017, and you've written about this as well, Focus on the Family, which is James Dobson's organization, we've talked about it in the past, reclassified itself as a church, right? So did the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Obviously, neither one is a congregation in any normal, sense of the word. So why are they churches now?
Because they don't have to report anything to the government to be a church. Focus on the Family said it was to protect their donors.
Right.
And I mean, okay, I can see that if you're running a bunch of dark money through your church and funding, or through your organization and funding a bunch of dark money super PACs and all this kind of stuff, I can see why you wouldn't want anyone to know who your donors are. So, I want people to understand, and we don't have to talk in a bunch of accounting jargon and tax jargon to help you understand. Churches do not have to tell the federal government how much money they bring in. They do not have to tell the federal government where they spend it. They're not required to tell their congregations that. Some states require churches to file this information, and in theory, it can be accessed through FOIA requests, but not every state requires that. And courts have ruled consistently that they won't get involved in disputes if a congregant says, I think my church defrauded me, because that violates the separation of church and state.
Right. It's a tricky balance, and courts don't really want to weigh in.
Right. So there's really no recourse for people who may have given money to a church group and feel like they've been defrauded. There's no way to prove that the money is being spent on the things that the church says they're going to spend it on. And in a denominational sense, I'm not attacking all churches here. Plenty of churches do what they say they're going to do with the money they're given. In a denominational sense, even though the individual churches might not have to report anything to their government or their congregations, they have to report to their denomination and give a percentage of their takings to the denomination every year. So there is oversight in denominations. But then let's look at the Catholic Church and Opus Dei. Opus Dei got a carve out from this. They don't have to report this stuff to the Vatican. They don't have typical oversight in the Catholic Church, which is one of the things that Francis and now Leo are trying to change, because they take in all this money and have all these assets, and the Vatican has no idea what they are. And lawsuits are starting to happen at Opus Dei for human trafficking and other violations of human rights. And so the Vatican's like, this is not cool that you've had this carve out and you've not been reporting anything for decades.
Right.
The same thing happens, and you wonder why there are these big non-denominational megachurches around the country and why they're so popular, and why these personalist groups like Doug Wilson's group, get started, and why that's so attractive to these people. They don't have to report this stuff. Joel Osteen, it's the Church of Joel Osteen.
Right.
So he doesn't have to report his earnings to a denominational head or oversight group. So in those kinds of instances, the church I grew up in was an independent Baptist church. There was no oversight group. So this structure is very attractive to people who may have good intentions. I'm not saying every one of these churches is being corrupt either, but it's very attractive and tempting to people who could be wanting to do things like enrich themselves and defraud their congregations.
But none of those guys, Joel Osteen doesn't want to enrich himself. I mean, it is called the gospel of prosperity, but I digress. You wrote about city elders, that's the Oklahoma group that Mark Wayne belongs to. And I like also that I can just say Mark Wayne and everyone in our audience knows exactly who I'm talking about.
Right.
But Leon Rogers, Jesse Leon Rogers, who kept this church kind of alive on paper, and even though there was no congregation, I was kind of blown away by that story. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Well, the IRS has 14 different points that they consider when deciding whether to allow a religious entity, to be a church. You don't have to meet all of them. It looks to me like you barely have to meet any of them to qualify with this government. So Jesse Leon Rogers got involved in a church a number of years ago, but he was not allowed to control the finances. He was not allowed to be a dictator. He was not allowed to expand the takings of the church. That he had oversight. He got really mad about it. So he went off and started his own church, which folded, but he kept the church alive on paper. And so that church exemption is what City Elders now classifies itself as a church with. So Jesse Leon Rogers is using that system to be very politically active with his City Elders group based on an old church designation that he got a number of years ago that he allowed to sit and not do anything with for a while.
And he's using the parsonage tax exemption on his family homes. Like it's a grift. But here's I think the broader point that we want to make with all of this, right? That number one, they want to give $1 billion to religious or Christian. There's that stupid thumb again.
It will be white Christian nationalist organizations.
Right.
So Catholic charities, for example, who are providing unhoused assistance for the unhoused migrants, they won't qualify.
Right.
Muslim organizations won't qualify.
Right.
Christian organizations that are progressive won't qualify. We have to help people understand who they're going to give this money to. It's not just general religious organizations.
Yep. And so we have the money that's going out to white Christian nationalist organizations. We also have the housing first policy being blown. Without that policy, there's essentially zero policy. There is no policy, right? We're going to give you the money if you qualify, and you'll qualify by being a white Christian nationalist organization. Mm-hmm. Then the third step of this is that a white Christian nationalist organization can categorize itself as a church, and you have no idea where that money goes. So it could be earmarked or on paper, theoretically, going towards, housing for the unhoused. But a Christian church, a white Christian nationalist church, may say that the first step in, solving homelessness is reelecting Donald Trump. Or
they could say the first step in solving this is pouring more money into evangelizing our community.
Because
and dealing with our community sin problem.
Exactly. The cause of homelessness is sin. So they could say the first step in battling homelessness is tackling the problem of sin. And what is sin? I think y'all know what sin is, right? It is going against your husband. It is being gay or non-binary or anything that doesn't align with what they are. That's sin. So this little weird wonky webinar is the whole picture, in my opinion.
Yeah. And as tough as it is to watch, people should watch it.
Yeah. So look, we talked about how your tax dollars are now God's money. The decision about who receives this money, though, is made locally and in public, right? We're on a bit of a time crunch. Every region in this country has something called a Continuum of Care. And it's a planning body that reviews applications, it ranks them, it sends the list to HUD. Those bodies tend to hold public meetings, and you got to find yours.
Mm-hmm.
You have to ask for the list of who applied and who got ranked, and go to the meeting if you can. That's what we need you to do, because
Mm-hmm.
applications close at the end of this month and awards come after that. So we have a real window here.
And I will, for my Friday newsletter, I'll try to find as much information as I can for people about where to go to do that, so that at least we can, by the time this runs, it will be available and people can access that and try
Wonderful.
to find out a little faster where they can go.
Yes. So, guys, you have your marching orders. You are in Unholy Ground, the Unholy Ground Army. Andra, always a pleasure. I really love these conversations every week. And everyone out there, if you're not subscribed to For Such a Time as This, get on it. Make it happen. And also, obviously, subscribe to Lincoln Square. We are really trying to build a coalition here and not just scream at you in media and content. We're really... one of my big goals is to foment this discussion with us, with you, with this whole crew. So appreciate you watching, appreciate you tuning in. Andra, we'll see you next week.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.